So what could possibly connect a 65-year-old unsolved mystery from a frozen mountain with the hyper-controlled reality of a modern-day nation? At first glance, absolutely nothing. But if you look a little closer, you'll see they are two sides of the exact same coin. The story a state tells its people and what happens when that story falls apart, or when it's the only story you're ever allowed to hear.
This is one of the last things 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov wrote in his journal. He and his 8 friends were about to step into one of the most chilling and bizarre mysteries of the 20th century. He had no idea just how terribly new everything was about to become.
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to dive into that mystery on the mountain. Then we'll look at why the official story just didn't add up. After that, we'll pivot to a country that has absolutely perfected controlling the narrative and see what life is like inside that system. And finally, we'll connect these two wild stories to really understand the power of a narrative.
Okay, let's set the scene. It's the middle of winter, February 1959, deep in the Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union. We have a group of 9 incredibly experienced hikers. We're talking expert skiers, university students, the best of the best. They make camp for the night on a mountain known by the locals as the Mountain of the Dead. Yeah, ominous, I know. And, well, they were never seen alive again.
So what started as a tough but pretty standard expedition went south, fast. One hiker, Yuri Yudin, got sick and had to turn back. That decision, right there, saved his life. The other 9 pushed on, setting up that final camp on February 1st. When they didn't return on time, a search party was sent out. And what they found? Well, it was something out of a nightmare.
Right away, the search party knew this wasn't just a simple accident. The first clue? The tent. It had been sliced open with a knife. Not from the outside like an animal attack, but from the inside. Think about that. Whatever happened in there was so terrifying that these seasoned hikers chose to slash their way out into a frozen wasteland instead of just using the door.
And when I say frozen wasteland, I mean it. The temperature that night was hovering around -30 Celsius. That's -22 Fahrenheit. Brutally cold. And yet, the first 2 bodies they found were near a tiny burnt-out fire, dressed only in their underwear. No shoes, no coats, nothing. Investigators then found a single line of footprints leading away from the wrecked tent. They went on for about 500 meters before the snow covered them up. But here's the part that'll give you goosebumps. The footprints weren't frantic. They weren't the prints of people running for their lives. No, the spacing showed they were walking calmly away from the very thing that made them cut their only shelter to pieces.
And this is exactly why the mystery has lasted for decades. The evidence is just a pile of contradictions. Some of the hikers had crushing internal injuries, like they'd been in a high-speed car crash, but they had no external wounds. One was missing her tongue. There were traces of radiation on their clothes, and branches on a nearby pine tree were snapped way up high, like someone was desperately trying to climb it. Every single clue just made things weirder.
So, you're the Soviet government. You have this impossible puzzle on your hands. How do you explain it? Well, their official story, as you might guess, only made things worse. After a quick 3-month investigation, the state came back with its official verdict. The hikers died from a compelling natural force. Basically, hypothermia. Case closed. But that neat little answer completely ignored, well, everything. The insane injuries, the radiation, the missing tongue, and the biggest question of all, why did they leave the tent? When the official story is that unbelievable, it creates what's called an information vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so do people. They started pouring their own theories into that empty space. Since it was the Cold War, a secret weapons test gone wrong was a popular idea that could explain the radiation. Others pointed to a weird photo from the hiker's camera of lights in the sky and screamed UFO. Of course, there were simpler ideas, like a small avalanche, but none of them could explain all the evidence.
And that's really the heart of it. By putting out a story that nobody could possibly believe, the Soviet state completely lost control of the narrative. The Dyatlov Pass incident wasn't just a tragedy anymore, it became a legend, a myth, that people are still obsessed with over 65 years later.
So that's what happens when a state's narrative fails. And it leads to a pretty wild thought. What happens in the opposite scenario? What does it look like when a state doesn't just fail to tell a story, but succeeds so completely that their story is the only one that even exists? And to answer that, we're jumping from 1959 Russia to modern-day North Korea. This is a country that represents the absolute peak of narrative control.
There is no information vacuum here, because the state controls every single word, image, and idea its citizens are exposed to.
Since 1948, the country has been run by just one family. First, the great leader Kim Il-sung, then his son, the dear leader Kim Jong-il, and now his grandson, the supreme leader Kim Jong-un. For over 7 decades, this dynasty has held on to power by building a totally sealed-off reality for its 26 million people.
So what is it actually like to live in a place where the government's story isn't just a story, it's reality? Let's take a look at some of the rules that shape everyday life there.
The state's control starts the moment you're born with something called the songbun system. It's basically a caste system where your entire life, your job, where you live, what you eat, is determined by how loyal your ancestors were. If your great-grandfather was a hero of the revolution, you're in the core class. If he was a landowner or had ties to South Korea, you're in the hostile class for life.
And the state enforces its narrative with some truly brutal rules. If you commit a political crime, say you try to escape the country, it's not just you who goes to a labor camp. The punishment extends to your entire family for 3 generations. Your kids and your grandkids will pay for your crime. It's a terrifying way to stamp out any thought of dissent.
The control gets down to the most personal things you can imagine, like your hairstyle. You can't just walk into a salon and get whatever you want. No. You have to choose from a list of government-approved haircuts. It sounds small, but it's about erasing individuality and any kind of outside influence.
And it's not enough to be loyal. You have to constantly perform your loyalty. Get this. On the anniversaries of the deaths of the past leaders, citizens are required to go out into the streets and publicly mourn. And if you're not crying hard enough or you don't look sad enough, you can be severely punished for it.
So how do they pull this off? They've built an information fortress. There's no public internet, just a tiny state-controlled version. All TV and radio is pure propaganda. Getting caught with a foreign movie or some K-pop can land you in a labor camp. They have sealed every single crack to make sure the state story is the only story.
Okay, let's bring these 2 stories back together. We've got the Dyatlov Pass, where the state story was a complete failure, and we've got North Korea, where the state story is a total success. So what do they really show us about the power of a narrative?
Well, you really see the 2 extremes here. The Dyatlov incident shows what happens when the state narrative breaks down. You get an information vacuum, which gets filled with chaos, conspiracy, and myth. The state completely loses control. In North Korea, it's the total opposite. The state saturates everything with its narrative, creating a chilling, absolute order. The state doesn't just tell the story. The state is the story.
So you go from a frozen mountain where the truth was lost to a sealed kingdom where the truth is manufactured. And it leaves us with a really big question, not just about these places, but about our own world. When we're surrounded by stories all the time, how do we know what's real? And if a single story is all you're ever given, how do you even begin to look for the truth?